Hi, everyone. I'm Gabrielle Lipton, the editor of Landscape News for the Global Landscapes Forum, and welcome to GLF Live. Today, February 11th, is International Day of Women and Girls in Science, which is a UN holiday that recognizes the vital role of gender equity in the sciences. So we're really lucky to have with us today Ko Barrett, who has not only risen to the top of her scientific field, but she's also helping make changes in the organizations in which she works to help other women do the same. She has a sweeping history as a climate policy expert and negotiator. Currently, she serves as the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Research at the US government body, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the NOAA. She also serves as the Vice Chair of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and she's the first woman to do so. Many of you will remember that the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees, released in 2018, had a huge effect on global climate policy and awareness. And upcoming at the end of this year or beginning of next, the IPCC will release another major report called the AR6, and we'll talk about that today, which will be of similar consequence and effect. So we're so lucky to have her with us today. Welcome, Ko. And throughout the course of this conversation, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box because we'll be taking questions from the audience at the end. But to start with, Ko, you received your bachelor's in science from the University of North Carolina, Asheville. What made you decide to study science?
First, if I could say, Gabrielle, I'm so happy to be here today and to just have a chance to kind of interact with your fabulous organization. I feel like the Global Landscapes Forum is really doing fabulous work in terms of landscape work and sustainability and equity. So I'm just honored to be among you and to interact with your network of kind of young professionals. In terms of your question, I guess it's fair to say that I've always been interested in science. I grew up in the space age where we were all wrapped with astronauts, and I was very interested in astronomy. I lived in a very urban area, so the only things I could really see from my telescope were the moon and people in apartments nearby, but still I was kind of wrapped with that. And then in my middle school years, that was when we celebrated the first Earth Day. And at the same time, I started doing some hiking, in the amazing natural landscapes that we have here in the US. And that just made a deep impression on me and kind of honed an interest in the environmental sciences. I had encouragement from my parents too, particularly my dad. And I had a couple of really fabulous science teachers who hooked me in. And I would just say, isn't that often the case? You interact with a mentor who just kind of links you in ways that are really powerful.
Mm-hmm. I think we've all had mentors in our youth that have driven us on the courses that we're on. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about your own mentorship later in this conversation. But I would like to jump directly into the IPCC AR6 report, which is set to be released, I believe, in a few stages over the course of the end of this year and early next, if all goes according to schedule. And it's a major report. It has more than 700 experts working on it, I believe, from around the world, and it's really going to have an influence on setting the climate change agenda for 2030. And what's interesting about this report is it's up to the percentage of women working on the report to about 30%, which is higher than ever before. So why did it choose to focus on gender equity in the drafting process for such a major report this time around?
Really great question. So as you pointed out, improving gender balance has been one of the priority activities of the panel during our current 6th assessment cycle. And during the past 15 years, the gender balance of lead authors has improved from a paltry 15% of women as lead authors to approximately 32% of women, leading some of the drafting in the current reports. And as you also mentioned, I am one of the first women elected as IPCC Vice-chair, but I do so along with the fabulously talented Thelma Krug from Brazil. The two of us are two of the three vice-chairs. So why have we focused on equity and gender issues? I guess I want to say, you can't hold good women down. But really, the IPCC, we seek to harness the best minds and diverse perspectives to comprehensively assess the current state of knowledge on climate change. And these diverse perspectives include regional as well as gender balance. We engage a lot of developing country scientists in our work. We also look to bring in experienced as well as new career scientists in the process, and experts and academics from a whole host of disciplines. Because we know from our experience that our reports are much more robust when we have diverse views reflected. So from a scientific point of view, it's important to have a gender focus. Research shows that girls and women are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And in many communities, women play an important role in addressing climate change. Their involvement in our reports brings important topics into our assessments. Mm-hmm. You mentioned, you asked, has this been, or let me offer, has this been a challenge to raise the proportion of women? Honestly, it is a bit of a challenge because we depend on author nominations by countries, and not every country who's involved in IPCC is focused on gender equality. But we try to hold outreach events in every country we visit for our author meetings or for our governmental plenaries. And we always make sure to highlight diversity, including women authors and young scientists in our outreach events and presentations. Because as an organization, our future depends on attracting these folks and upcoming scientists.
Absolutely. So what effect does incorporating more women into the drafting process have on the report and the outcomes itself? You touched on this a bit, but if you could speak more to it, that would be great.
Yeah, I think, it's just fair to say that women bring a different perspective of the world. They also tend to go into, I don't want to overgeneralize, but sometimes women go into different aspects of the scientific fields. And as we are learning more and more about climate change, we realize that our reports have got to branch out. We started initially in the IPCC looking really at the physical science aspects. But as we've, come to live with climate change for all these many years, we realize we've got to be looking at the social sciences. We've even got to be looking at behavioral sciences, because some of the kind of information that underpins how people act comes from, behavioral aspects. And so as we branch into broader fields of science and assess the information there, we're finding that in many cases, women are the world leaders on that information.
Mm-hmm. You've been with the IPCC through some major moments. It won a Nobel Prize in 2007. It released the 1.5 degree report a few years ago, which made headlines. So the IPCC itself has really grown to become a household name in many places, which is huge for such a scientific organization. How has this outward increase in notoriety affected its internal goals for equity?
Well, I will say it has been a fun ride. But don't forget the reports that we released after 1.5 report, because we had one that was entirely focused on climate and land, and another special report on oceans and cryosphere, which is the frozen parts of the Earth. And both of these, I think, are directly relevant to your important work. Mm-hmm. But I'll say that over the 30 plus years of IPCC reports, we have expanded our focus to issues like sustainability, equity, and just transitions, important aspects needed to advance real lasting climate solutions. our reports are not really responsive to kind of external acclaim or notoriety. They're driven by the assessment of available science. But fortunately, the science has evolved to be kind of more inclusive. Also, I think it's important to note we've had some really world-class women scientists involved in our reports over the years, who have created a model for others to follow. I think about Susan Solomon, who's best known for having both pioneered the theory of explaining how and why ozone holes occur in Antarctica, and obtaining some of the first chemical measurements establishing that man-made CFCs were the cause. Susan led one of our assessment reports. Currently, we have Thelma Krug, who I mentioned before, from Brazil, who has had a long respected career working on land use and forestry issues. We have Valérie Masson-Delmotte, a French paleoclimatologist, and Deborah Roberts, a South African urban practitioner leading reports. So look at just the diversity among those folks. And I think we all know from experience that when you have women in prominent roles, you attract women to want to participate. It's kind of as simple as that.
Thank you for naming some of those specific women and what they're studying. I think it's really nice to hear their names out loud and to bring them more attention. And this leads a bit into one of my other questions, which is that the IPCC puts a heavy degree of importance on the communication of its reports. So how is it working to communicate the work of its women scientists, and how does that play into the work of the IPCC?
Yeah, I'm glad you're raising this question, because we've learned over the years that we need to pay more attention to the communication of our reports, because as you pointed out, they increasingly have real import in general society. When we release a report, it gets a fair amount of media play. And we put out our summaries for policymakers, which in each report, which are supposed to kind of provide a more plain language description of some of the findings in our reports. But even there, we have struggled to sometimes portray complex topics and all the uncertainty or certainty associated with those findings in ways that are easily understandable. So over the years, we've really recognized we need to do a better job of communicating. And we brought in specialists to help us to streamline graphics and to revisit our wording and to kind of work as translators for scientific information. That's been tremendously helpful. Really, women play the same roles as men, explaining the science they are renowned for, but they potentially reach different audiences. And research shows that when it comes to climate change, it matters if the audience views the communicator as a trusted member of their community. I know I've said this, more than once, and I will say it more than once again, but diversity matters in reaching the broadest number of people with our messages. So having women talking about the science that they are world experts on, just kind of brings in a community that we might not otherwise reach.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And what you said before about having women attracts more women. It's a win-win. I want to get back a bit to how you've progressed on your own career, which is a very interesting story, I believe. And when you were brought on to the NOAA, I read someone describing you from within the organization as having a savvy sense of organizational and policy issues and a willingness to challenge the status quo in unselfish and constructive ways, which I think is a really beautiful description. So I was wondering, how do you view yourself as a woman leader in science? What traits have come naturally, and what traits have you had to learn in the process to get to where you are in your career?
Well, I guess first I should say that's a kind thing for someone to say. I'd not heard that before. But I do strive to challenge the status quo where appropriate, I guess. In fact, that's the role of science, really. What do we know and what do we still need to discover? Science is always evolving. And it has been interesting to be involved in climate science over 20 years and to see how our certainty about climate change has been increasing as our understanding evolves. To be honest, I traced my growth as a woman leader in science to my early experiences as an athlete. There are so many traits that cross over to help inspire perseverance in the face of adversity, for example. There are times where, as a young woman scientist, I had to assert myself in cultural settings where a woman's voice was not necessarily encouraged. I learned how to be courageous on the playing field and to take that into scientific leadership. There were times where I would be told I didn't have the, you name it, experience, knowledge, degree to do a job. And I had to have the courage to chart my own course to success. But most importantly, I learned how to be a team player, that we only get far by going together. And this last quality, most embodied in collaboration, is probably really the most important to advancing science, because you really need to have diverse experience and diverse perspectives coming together to solve big complex problems like climate change. We need to look at it from every angle to understand the complexity and where the solutions lie. And research bears this out. We all bring unconscious biases into decision making, and we need others with different perspectives to challenge those biases and to bring us to a better understanding. I think I'm a natural leader, or maybe my leadership skills were honed early by sports, but I have had to learn a whole slew of skills that do not come naturally, I will be honest. For example, like many women, I have often discounted my experience or questioned the value I bring. I'll bet that women who are listening to this right now can relate to that, because it's very, very common. I've come to understand just how common it is for girls and women. Sometimes we can be our own worst critic. So I really work on this. Also, as a leader, I've had to work on making space for different working and communication styles, to be patient so that everyone feels heard and included. Sometimes the pressure to lead can also be a pressure to move fast and to not take the time to be inclusive. So I work on that as well. And honestly, I am not a natural public speaker. I like to have one-on-one conversations. So Gabrielle, it's great to be doing this, but I really do have to stretch and work hard to present to large groups of people. And it's a work in progress. But maybe I'll just close by saying, I found my niche in kind of encouraging leadership through athletics. But there's a whole host of ways for women and girls to find their niche for leadership. It can be music. It can be a whole host of other pathways into leadership. But I think, finding it in one place makes it possible to use it in another.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, to learn different skill sets and apply them across our lives. And I really liked what you said before about how we can be our own worst critics. I think it's very true that sometimes we have these unconscious biases against ourselves. In the time of your work and over the course of your career, well, first I'll backtrack a bit by stating some facts that I think my colleague has dropped in the chat box, but just to repeat them, that women compose only 30% of researchers in science globally. There are huge pay gaps between women and men in the sciences. Women often publish less than men, etc. Over the course of your career, what gaps between men and women have you noticed as being the most pronounced, and how do we overcome these?
Well, look, I've seen the gaps that occur from years of working within scientific cultures dominated by men. In some ways, it's a club that has needed to be blown open to make space for the legitimate contributions of women. And I can recount the challenges I've witnessed over my career. But if you would indulge me, I think I'd rather talk about the challenges I've seen, the changes that I've seen, driven by generation after generation of girls and women who, like we were just talking about, recognize their worth and indulge their scientific passion and curiosity. It's powerful. And, women supporting and encouraging each other to work hard and succeed is a force to be reckoned with. To take positions of leadership and balance that with home life and other responsibilities, it takes bravery. And I've seen so many changes over the course of my multi-decadal career. And I'll also say, we are seeing changes by many, many male scientists who are working hard as allies to make for a level playing field. So rather than focus on what's holding us back, I just like to maybe take a second to focus on what's pushing us forward so powerfully. And, as a person who's, older, in my 60s, I just look at folks who are working in the youth movement or early career scientists, and I'm just so grateful for the bravery that they bring to the table to push to have their voices heard.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those inspiring words. I was going to ask what questions you would give to young aspiring scientists, but it seems you've already answered that, unless there's any other motto or something you would want to put on a billboard, some inspiration to give to young women.
Go for it. Don't be held back. Follow your passion. I just feel like sometimes we lose girls, especially in middle school, where I guess all middle school age kids have a tendency to be more self-conscious. They're very concerned about their peer groups. But, it's interesting. The research shows that we lose a lot of girls in the sciences there because they stop engaging or asking questions. So we just need to be brave and step up and realize that there are many, many people around who can help you to reach your dreams. And I would just encourage people, seek them out. They're probably waiting to help you.
Mm-hmm. I hope so. And that brings our conversation full circle back where we started with mentorship. I'd like to go now to some questions from the audience while we still have time. And to anyone who's listening on Crowdcast or Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, please do drop your questions in the chat box. We have some great ones already. So I'll start with a few. There's an overlap between a couple people who are asking about Indigenous women and how do we encourage and uplift Indigenous women's voices and participation in scientific processes?
Oh, I love that question. Because Indigenous women and Indigenous cultures are really impacted by climate change. And in so many cases, they have long, long histories of adapting to change. And they have a wealth of knowledge that doesn't necessarily appear in our scientific journals, but is entirely relevant to crafting solutions in the climate space. It's interesting. In the IPCC, but I would also say just across all UN agencies, there has been a concerted effort to engage Indigenous people and to bring their knowledge into the information that we assess, particularly in IPCC. And that's really important. I'll just share a story. I was the champion for the IPCC report on oceans and cryosphere, so the frozen parts of the world. And I knew I was going to be called upon to be one of the major communicators for that report. So sometimes when you're a communicator for scientific reports, it's really easy to just be very sciencey and data oriented. But I felt like I would do a better job, from my heart, if I had interaction with some of the people who were being impacted by the impacts we were demonstrating in the report. So I went up to Alaska and I visited with a native community just right on the edge of the Bering Sea in Shishmaref, and met with those people to hear the stories about the ways that climate change has been impacting their lives. And it was just tremendously powerful to hear stories of how just going off to do their kind of sustenance hunting in the old ways, people were being lost by, traveling across the ice and having it be too thin to hold up a family member. And it's just so powerful to hear those stories and to hear their experience and to connect it with people. So I feel like Indigenous communities are just essential to this whole process moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And is there anything you can say on their role in the upcoming AR6 report?
I know that we are assessing Indigenous knowledge as part of the report. I don't know offhand how many are actual authors of the report, but I can say with certainty that knowledge is being assessed as part of the report.
Mm-hmm. A similar question is, you mentioned before about countries that don't prioritize gender equity, or countries where it's a bit more of a struggle for women to rise to certain positions. How do we assist those women? How do we overcome those barriers in countries where this isn't a priority issue?
Yeah, so I mentioned that one of the direct ways that we do it is by holding outreach events in all the countries that we go to, and just showing the model for having smart women, smart young scientists, scientists of color, all a part of our panels to demonstrate the diversity of good scientists who are helping to improve our reports. We have the ability also, we do, as I said, we depend on countries to nominate authors. We also just collectively from the leadership of IPCC will be looking out across the global community of scientists and recommending some of our, some scientists that we know through our own interactions would be worthwhile to have on the, working on the report. And the other thing is, women themselves can insert themselves into this process. The IPCC reports have a whole review, a really robust review process where anyone can nominate themselves to be an expert reviewer of the report and just interact with us kind of directly by providing comments on our drafts. And often that's a way for us to come to know people who we might not normally know, and to, kind of be able to value their contributions and to consider their perspectives.
Mm-hmm. That's a really important and valuable mechanism to have built into your process.
It is.
So we have two questions here about, I guess you could say, inherent traits of women or traits that are commonly associated with women. And one is about women being natural collaborators. How do you, in terms of bringing about more change in these scientific processes, how are women facilitators or helping overcome silos and collaborate more effectively?
Yeah, I don't consider myself a natural collaborator. I've really been working on it. So, but I have seen so many women who are just fabulous collaborators and importantly, inclusive facilitators of conversations. And just having women involved changes the conversation, often, around the table. And I don't want to overgeneralize because, we're all individuals and we all kind of come with our different perspectives. But I will just say in my own experience, having women sitting around the table sometimes softens the conversation. It maybe is not so in your face. It's like, can we make space for different communication styles? I think in ways, there are some ways in which I've excelled because as an athlete, I push myself. I will elbow others out so they don't talk over me. But not everybody does that, and not everybody should have to do that. So, just having a diversity of perspectives sitting at the table so that we make space for people's natural communication styles and, their ability to contribute in really meaningful ways has been helped by having women at the table. It's also helped, by the way, by having young scientists at the table, because there are, there's a focus on safe spaces and things like that they bring that generationally I didn't grow up with, and I love that. I think it really adds to the way that we conduct our business.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think younger generations also bring a different vocabulary and a different tool set and a different outlook completely to these processes.
Absolutely.
Another related question is asking about silos that exist within the NGO spaces. And there's more and more research looking at the interlinkages between climate and biodiversity and land degradation and so on. What role, and again, you touched on this in the last question, but how are you seeing women play a role in overcoming these silos and bringing the different sciences together?
Well, I'm not an expert on the way that NGOs are siloed. In fact, I would say from my perspective, especially as a former climate negotiator, I found the NGO perspective to be really helpful in breaking down silos. I often have kind of described the experience of being a negotiator, particularly I have been for the U.S., as being greatly positively influenced by the NGOs who are bringing in the perspectives of folks from outside the government, who, because of their advocacy for various aspects, in my case of the climate agenda, they've really widened the space for compromise. And, and that's been valuable. So my own experience isn't really that NGOs come kind of siloed, but I can imagine how that happens just like it does in governments. And, I think part of the solution to breaking down those silos is realizing just how complex some of these problems are and how much you need to engage people who have a different perspective or a different scientific expertise that can, help to do a better job of focusing on solutions. I mentioned before, broadening out to the social sciences and looking at folks who are assessing, the solution space. All of that helps us to present a better picture of what's happening with global climate change, but also what are the potential responses.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One question coming from Dolores. In less developed countries, often the head of the national focal points are men, and these are the people that nominate others to join the IPCC, I understand. So that can create a barrier for women. What would you suggest or have done to work around this challenge?
Yeah, Dolores, great question. And I was referencing exactly that. We have, from an IPCC perspective, we have a focal point in every country who often is the head of the delegation that comes to IPCC meetings, but they also have the role of nominating scientists. So a lot depends on, how attuned those focal points are, or the people around them who are kind of gathering the nominations to the importance of gender equity. I think one of the things that we've done recently that's helping is that we have adopted a new gender policy and an implementation plan. And we've kind of ensconced in that policy the importance of engaging our work from an equity perspective, and also, some specific actions that we can be taking to encourage a better gender balance. And I guess I would say, it's always important when an organization kind of just adopts a policy on something as important as this to send the message that we take this seriously.
Mm-hmm. And then a last question with respect for your time, and I think this is a nice one to end on, but our listener Judith is asking if there are books or, and we can broaden that out to any other resources things to listen to, films to watch, mentors that you've had, public figures that we can look up to for young women leaders to get more inspiration and knowledge?
Oh, that's a really great question. And I would benefit from the kind of collective thinking of people who are a part of this conversation to share resources on that. One that comes to mind, just because at NOAA we have a group of women leaders who get together monthly to just discuss challenges and opportunities that we're all facing in our work. And recently we watched this movie called Picture a Scientist, which is, it kind of tracks 3 women scientists and the challenges that they've encountered in their careers. It's really focused on kind of the challenges they've had, but there's some useful information about, how they've overcome that and where they used data to kind of make their points, because sometimes data is the language of the realm. But there's, some really interesting things there. That film has also got a study guide associated with it that then links to other resources that I also found valuable. For example, there were some kind of bias tests that you could access to see where you have unconscious biases. That, kind of I referenced before, how strongly I believe we need to kind of work actively to check our unconscious biases. So that's one that comes to mind. But if you gather those ideas from folks who are participating now, I would love to also expand, my knowledge of important resources.
Absolutely. I think that would be a really nice thing for us to do, and perhaps we can work to find a way to do that and crowdsource from our community some really great resources. Could you say the name of that film one more time, just to make sure if people missed it?
I think it's called Picture a Scientist.
Picture a Scientist. Great, thank you.
If I have that wrong, I'll send you a note, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Okay,
great. Well, Ko, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you on this holiday, and we really appreciate your time. Is there anything else you would like to add or like to say to all the women and girl scientists out there listening?
Well, first, I'd just like to thank you for having me. It gave me a chance to kind of look at your organization and to just be kind of blown away by the good work you're doing. So really, what I just want to say is just bring your passion to science or whatever your passion is, but be brave in that and don't give up. And as I said, there are plenty of people sitting around waiting to mentor you. Don't be afraid to ask.
Thank you. That's a really nice message to end on. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Ko, and we'll see you next time on GLF Live.